Good evening, everybody. Hello, and welcome to a Wednesday night Bible study here at Faith Baptist Church's Facebook and YouTube Live. So glad to have you guys this evening. Do be in prayer for one another. I don't think I have anything new for you guys this evening as far as updates or prayer requests go. If you guys have something, an update to a prayer request, something we're already praying for, we've got a few things we're praying for. You saw some of that on the pre-show. The rest of it will be on the Sunday services and so forth. So I'm just getting caught up here a little bit. 3 days ago, a few seconds ago. So thank you so much, Sylvia, for the like. I appreciate that so much. And all you fellas liking and stuff on YouTube, I appreciate y'all as well. Yeah, so I'm just looking through here. I don't see anything that even says December yet. So no updates on GroupMe. I can check Discord, but it's going to say the same things. So you guys just continue to be in prayer for one another. Like I said, if you have an update or a prayer request, be sure to let us know. We'll pray for you, or for your loved one, or your friend, or your enemy, or whoever it happens to be. So we are continuing on. Good evening. We are continuing on our series through the book of Hebrews. We spent a very long time on the Hall of Faith because you can afford to do that in the Hall of Faith, right? With other books of the Bible, you get really bogged down in the weeds in one particular section, and it's really hard to stay focused for that long. But in the Hall of Faith, we're going through all kinds of different parts of the Bible, right? We're in Genesis, we're in Exodus, we're in Joshua, we're in Judges. You know, we're all over the place, and it's been a really fun sort of journey through the book of Hebrews. We're near the end of Hebrews 11. As a matter of fact, I can show you guys real quick. Now, I don't know why it was popping up perfectly fine. On one program it will pop up, on the other one it will not. So it was working fine on one, now it's working fine on the other, but never both at the same time. Here we go. Okay, so let me show you guys real quick what I'm talking about in our Hall of Faith. Because I don't know at what point you're joining us in this series, but we're pretty deep into the book of Hebrews. So we're way down here in verse 32 where it says, "And what shall I more say, for time would fail me to tell." So he could go on in this section about all these other people, but for sake of time, he's just going to say their names and sort of sum up other things that happened in the Old Testament. Time would fail me to tell of Gideon, which is Gideon in the Old Testament, and of Barak. We've talked about both of those people. Of Samson, we've talked about Samson, and of Jephthah. We told Jephthah's story a few weeks back. Tonight we're on our next person is David. Now everybody knows a lot about the life of David, and there are certain parts of his story we could tell. Right, we could tell of his struggle to become king. He dealt with a few I wouldn't call them rebellions. It was more like a civil war, right? And it was these tribes against these tribes, and they had their king, and then these tribes had David as king. And for many, many years, he dealt with that civil war until they reunited together. But David dealt with one war after another his entire time as king. Good evening, Ryan. Good to see your name pop up as well. And so what we have is a series of battles that David fought. And so we could talk about his life at great length. But I think when we're doing these stories, right, I think the purpose here in Hebrews 11 is to apply it to matters of faith, right? So when I'm looking through the stories of David's life, I'm asking myself, which of David's many famous and incredible stories teach us about faith? And not just teach us about faith and his faith and so forth, because we could talk about some of his failures and his failure to have faith, but that's not really the theme we see in Hebrews 11, right? It's talking about faith giving us a victory or a win of some kind, and how tremendous that is. And also, I like for these things to be something that applies, right? Something that you can take and sort of apply into your own life, plug it in, and it does something for you. Thank you so much for the like on Facebook. I appreciate that. And also you YouTube guys as well. I appreciate those. So the story we're going to be telling this evening is in 1 Samuel chapter 17. You know the story. You may not have that portion of Scripture memorized exactly what this chapter is, but it's Goliath, as you can see there. So it's Goliath's challenge is the way I call it. Tonight I'm calling this lesson Learning to Fight Giants, right? Because David is still a young man here. He's too young even to be drafted into the war. So this is the time of Saul as king, and he's been fighting with these Philistines. They're on top of one hill. The Philistines are on top of another hill. There's a valley in between them. And Goliath steps forward to challenge Israel. And so this is what happens. It says here in verse 4, there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath. Gath is a city in Philistia, of the Philistines, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now here in a minute, I'm going to give you all of the details we have about Goliath and how big he was and how big all these things are. In verse 5, he says he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 500,000 shekels of brass, and he had greaves of brass upon his legs and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. A weaver's beam is like, you know what a beam is? Maybe if you know anything about construction or building houses and so forth, there's a beam that holds up our ceiling in the house that I live in right now that I'm doing this Bible study from. And it's massive, and that's about what we're talking about when we talk about a weaver's beam, a massive piece of construction of wood. It says his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him because his shield was also so massive. So these are the measurements we get for Goliath, right? And to break that down for you, Goliath was about, because these measurements are based on sort of from your fingertip to your elbow kind of span. It's not exact measurements like we have today, right? So they're based on human anatomy, and based on the human, that could be different. So about 9 foot 9 inches tall is our best guesstimate. This was a big dude, 9 feet 9 inches tall. His chainmail, just his chainmail. So when you're putting on armor, you have different varying parts of the armor that you wear. It almost looks like somebody did crochet on metal rings, little tiny metal rings, and like they knitted together an entire metallic metal ring sweater or something like that. So that's chainmail. And his chainmail alone, just the chainmail, weighed 125 pounds. Okay? And just the head of his spear. So if you've ever like found an arrowhead out in the woods, is when you're playing as a kid, we did a lot back when there were woods next to us over here. There was, it's an arrowhead. It's about like that, Good evening, Miss Christie. Good to see your name pop up as well. But the arrowhead, the head of his spear alone, just the head, not the whole thing, just the head, weighed 15 pounds. 15 pounds. That's as big as some dumbbells that you exercise with. 15 pounds. The rest of the spear is about, and again, these are estimations because they're not exact science. Excuse me. It was about 26 feet long. 26 feet long. This was his spear that he used in combat. So these are the measurements of the giant, right? And notice what the giant says here in verse 8. He stands up, he cries unto the armies of Israel, and he said unto the armies of Israel, said unto them, why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine? And ye servants to Saul, Saul was their king at the time, choose you a man for you, and let him come down to meet me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants. and serve us. So what Goliath is offering them here in these couple of verses is the opportunity to avoid war. In a war, many, many people might die, and you would wind up with the same result, right? If their army defeats Israel, they're all going to go into servitude anyways. Right? So what Goliath is saying here is, you pick a champion, I'll be our champion, we'll fight, and that will determine the outcome of the war instead of all these people dying. He didn't really care about that. He just was quite sure there was nobody who could beat him, and this was a quicker and easier way of getting Israel to be their servants. That was where his mindset was as a warrior, as a soldier of the Philistines. Verse 10, the Philistines said, this is Goliath still, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Not just all Israel, right? That's what you see right there is all Israel. But what we don't read sometimes is, this is important to understand grammar, right? Because what we read is Saul, right? So there are two kinds of nouns in this sentence, right? So you have all Israel as one noun. That's a plural noun. It's multiple people. It's the entire nation of Israel that heard the words and were dismayed and greatly afraid. But it also tells us that Saul, the king, God's chosen king, that God chose Saul out of all others to become the king of Israel. God handpicked this man. He's been through some stuff up to this point, and he's lost God's favor. But King of Israel Saul, their leader, their guide, the man that's supposed to lead their entire country as their king, was dismayed and greatly afraid. That's a big deal, guys. It's a big deal because it's easy to stand up for something when you've got an army behind you, right? Saul has proven his prowess in battle many, many times. But every one of those times, it was with his army. It was on the battlefield. You know, he had slain thousands of men in his day, but that was all part of a battle, right? So when this giant shows up and asks for a champion, even the king of Israel is hiding behind his throne scared. They all are. Every one of these soldiers is hiding under their bunks, terrified and afraid. And this is where it starts to apply to us. Because we face some giants in life. We're going to. You're going to face those giants. There may be a giant that comes to your work tomorrow. Maybe you're going to have a problem at work. Maybe you think that if you handle this problem the wrong way, it'll cost you your job. Right? That's a giant. That's a spiritual giant. Maybe in your relationship, you come across, and usually more in those early years than in the later years, right? But no matter where you are in your relationship, the devil's going to try to send giants in your way to try to destroy that relationship. And you've got to learn to fight those giants, right? In all kinds of aspects of life, in your spiritual life, in your church life, God is going to use people in the church to discourage you from going to church. He's going to use people he shouldn't be able to use. Sometimes he'll use the people you love the most to attack you and to destroy your spirit. There are going to be giants coming after you, and we got to learn to fight them. And folks, it's easy to fight giants when we got an army of people standing with us. When we're sitting here in church service, everything is going great. It's easy to worship God, to stand up and say, "Oh, how I love Jesus." It's easy to say that then. But it's when we're at work, it's when we're in the middle of the world, it's when we're standing alone against an army. That's when we've got to learn to fight some giants. That's when it matters the most. And yes, it's so much harder, but that's when it matters. And they're all standing there, and they're all afraid, and they're all terrified, and they don't know what to do. Enter David. Right now, what makes David such an incredible hero in this story? There's so many different parts to this story, so many different things we can point to about David and say, man, he did that really well, or man, he did that really great. But what is it about David that makes him such a great hero in this story? We're going to see. You hang in there with me. We're going to see. So David's story starts around here in verse 20. I've kind of cut out some of this. If you want to go read that on your own personal time, please feel free to do it. It fills in the story in a lot of really cool ways. There are some details in here that really add to elements of the story later. But for sake of our lesson tonight, we're going to start in verse 20. So in verse 20, it says, David rose up early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, because that's what you do when the shepherd is leaving. You leave it in the hands of a keeper. He doesn't love the sheep the way you do, but that's what you do. David loved those sheep, leaving them with somebody he trusts, but somebody he knows doesn't love them the way that he does. It's really important for another lesson entirely about the good shepherd, right? David is a great picture of Jesus, is the point I'm trying to make. So he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight and shouted for the battle. For Israel and Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. So nobody took up the champion's challenge, Goliath. So David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran to the army and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines and spake according to the same words, and David heard them. So they had another skirmish, and after that skirmish, everybody went back to their camps. Goliath went back into the valley where the battles were taking place and declared his challenge again. This time, it's a little different, because this time, David was there to hear it. It says, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. The only difference is David is here to see it. They say, why does that make a difference? Well, let's read and find out. The men of Israel said, have ye seen this man that has come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. You never need to worry about going into debt and being in servitude to another person. In other words, that the king will guarantee your credit no matter what. That is a pretty good deal. But you got to go slay a giant first. You see, there are blessings in giant slaying. You just got to learn how to slay those giants. David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth the Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? So in other words, David's saying, who does this nobody think he is? Because he's bigger than us, and he's bad, he's a lot of armor, his really big spear. He thinks that's going to guarantee him some sort of victory. Who does he think he is? We're the armies of the living God. Hadn't he heard about what Moses did? Didn't he hear about Joshua conquering this whole land? Didn't he hear about all the stories of all these judges? Never heard of a guy named Samson? Who does this guy think he is? He can't stand up to us. Look at the power we get. And this is what he's bringing, right? And it sounds encouraging, and it sounds amazing, and it sounds inspiring. But to them, it sounds like pandering. It sounds cheesy, and it's something they just don't want to hear. They might say things like, yeah, David, that sounds great, but this is the real world. Right? Things like that. The people answered him after this manner, saying, so shall it be done to the man that killeth him. So this is kind of where we come into the whole, you're just a kid, you've never seen war, you don't know what you're talking about. We get in that with his oldest brother, Eliab. Right. So Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why camest thou down hither? And to whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart. Thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. So, in other words, this Eliab, and we're going to come to why this phrase is important, but he's accusing David of things he's not guilty of. He's accusing David of just abandoning the sheep in the wilderness. Dad has no clue you're actually here. You just wanted to come check out and spy on the soldiers and give us all a hard time. None of that was true, but that's what Eliab just said. David said, what have I now done? Tell me where my sin is. Right? That's a good question. Now, ask yourself this question. The people that I'm angry at, can I name their sin? If I can't name their sin, why am I angry at them? And if you can't name their sin, can you name your own sin? And maybe the person that needs to repent is you. Right? Are we like Eliab, where we are angry unnecessarily? And again, we're going to dive into that in a little bit. But it says he turned from him toward another and spake after the same manner, and the people answered him again after the former manner. So a few things I want to break down in just this portion we've read so far is that, first of all, when learning to fight giants, you've got to have courage. If you're going to learn to fight giants, you've got to have some courage. And it's so very important, not just for fighting Goliath, but for fighting the giants that are going to pop up in our own life. Notice that David's courage stems from his faith. That's the whole point of mentioning David in Hebrews 11, in what we call the Hall of Faith, is about his victories through his faith. His strength doesn't come from working out, from training, from practice. His strength comes from God, right? And that's kind of what we saw with the beginning with Saul. But Saul became afraid and hid, just like everybody else did. But David, he had some courage, and that courage came from his faith. And that's why the Bible talks about a childlike faith, because it's before we grow up to the point where we convince ourselves that faith doesn't really give us strength. That's not the way it works in the real world. It's exactly the way it works in the real world. What we're convinced of otherwise are the acts of evil men. Right? But the Bible says that David's courage stems from his faith in the living God. That's what we learn here. David had grown up with these stories, right? The stories that we just mentioned, incredible victories of God dropping oceans on the head of the Egyptians, holding the sun still in its place when Joshua was conquering the promised land, dropping fire and brimstone from heaven, strengthening the judge of Israel to defeat thousands of Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. That he's grown up hearing all of these stories, and that David was still young enough to believe that the stories he grew up hearing from great-great-grandma Rahab and Grandma Ruth would be true for himself as well. And it turns out, by the way, spoiler alert, he was right. That these stories that we hear about in the Bible, we think, well, yeah, they're great analogies and they tell a beautiful story, but they don't seem very real. They're absolutely real. They got this literal strength from the literal God, and we can too. Literal strength of mental strength and spiritual strength and strength of heart and strength of mind, and yes, even on the rare occasion, physical, actual strength. We can gain from the Lord in all kinds of ways if we will just have faith. That's all we need. He has this faith in these things, and then his courage is doubted by the other soldiers, and even especially by his own brother. Because he's going to these people, he's trying to convince them to stand up and fight, and he's asking about these blessings, and why is nobody taking him up on this, and they're not getting up, and they're not going, and nobody's doing, and then finally Eliab comes up and gives him a hard time about these things. But his own courage is doubted even by his own brother. His brother just assumes he's there to cause trouble, or he's there to spy in through the fence or something. I'm just going to say this. We would like to believe that family will be the first ones to believe in us. That's the way it should be, isn't it? It should be that your family will be the first ones to support you. That your family will be the first ones to defend you, to have your back, no matter what happens. But sometimes it is hard for someone that watched you grow up believe that the same person is capable of doing incredible things. We see this with David. We see this with Jesus. He returns to his own hometown. Remember that? Mark 6:4, Jesus said, "A prophet is not without honor, save in his own home and among his own kin." Right? What is he saying there? He's saying that when you return home, you're not a prophet anymore. When Jesus returns back to Nazareth, they don't think of him as the Messiah anymore. They don't think of him as the Christ anymore. He's just Jesus, the son of the carpenter. We know who this guy is. He's nothing special. We watched him grow up. Right? Same thing about David here. In David's life, his oldest brother Eliab, known him since he was a kid, and to be honest with you, in Eliab's eyes, he's still pretty much a kid. He just sits out there in the field all day with those sheep. Well, if he had any idea what it meant to be a shepherd, he'd know why God rejected him as king over Israel and chose David. That's why Eliab's a little sore here. One chapter before this, in chapter 16, God sends Samuel to the house of Jesse. That's David and Eliab's dad. And he sends him there to anoint the next king of Israel after Saul has passed away. And Samuel is there to see who it's going to be. And he stands before Eliab because Eliab's the biggest, he's the oldest, he looks like a king, he sounds like a king. He just is the picture of what you might choose if you were going to choose somebody to be the next king of Israel. And he stands before him and he goes to bless him, and God says, nope, he's not the one. And that's where God teaches, don't look on his countenance or his stature, for I have refused him. And God says, therefore I seeth not as man seeth, or man looketh on the outward appearance, but God looketh on the heart. He goes from the oldest all the way down. It chooses none of them until they go fetch David out of the shepherd's field, and God chooses David. Little young David that nobody thought much of. As adults, we have a tendency to doubt the potential of the children that we once knew. Children have more faith than most adults. They're capable of far more than we give them credit for. But even after they become adults, still a lot of times we don't treat them like adults. It causes them to do extreme things for people to try to see them as adults. You know, I've got to do these things. I've got to talk this way. I've got to, all these things so that they can be seen as an adult because they don't feel like they are. I've never thought that way. Even when kids were kids, I've never thought of them the way most other people do. But, Jesus had to say a lot about his love for the children of this world. And I want to, mention something to you real quick here. 1/3 of the world's population is children. So if we're going to talk about fulfilling God's call to reach the world with the gospel, you're not going to be able to leave them out. Just because David was younger, it didn't omit him entirely. We have watched, and I'm not going to soapbox this. Give me just a second. We'll get right back into it. But we have watched in our own day and time, the past 20, 30 years, we have watched an entire generation of people grow up in church, be treated like garbage that needs to be pitched into the corner until we're ready for it. We've watched an entire generation go from being treated like that to growing up hearing a lot of the hate and a lot of the prejudice that you find in churches, that you have found in churches, a lot of the rejection and anger and animosity that have an entire generation of Christians saying, I don't want anything to do with that anymore. And an entire generation grow up and leave the church because of it. And you got a lot of these non-denominational churches that people are going to church for. But I have spoken to people that go to these non-denominational churches, and every time I speak to one, they're not going there for the preaching. Right? They're not going there because they're getting closer to God. They're going there because they've got some really great programs. They're going there because they like the music. They're going there because they've got friends that go there. They're involved in these ministries that are there. All these other big conglomerate reasons. I think I've met one person in my entire life that goes to these kinds of churches for the preaching. And if that's the case, that's great. More power to you. But the problem is they're sick of it. And they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And what we need is to come back to this ideology that God had. Not tossing the people we don't like out of church. Not leaving them out of our social club. We're going to come over here in the corner and talk because you don't fit in. Right? We need to come back to the kind of mission and commission and work that Christ put us to in the first place. Churches have become a social club. They've replaced the Leopard's Lodge or whatever it was back in the 50s. And these people don't have anywhere to hang out, so they do it at the local church and they gripe about the Democrats. It is not what a church was meant to be. I know about this. That's why I started my church. Because I was one of those that got rejected. I didn't fit into the cool kids table. And so I was not welcome in any of these churches anymore. So I went and started my own. And you know what? I found a whole group of people that felt the same way about it. An entire church congregation of people that said, yeah, you know what? We felt the same way about churches. A whole group of people that said, I used to go, I used to be involved. Then the pastor showed up one day and decided that this guy with a big check didn't like me. So now I'm out. Every single time. And so we got together and we decided, you know what? Let's do this church, but let's do it different. If you want to tie the big check to this church, God bless you. But don't think it's going to change my mind on people or things or decisions, right? Because we got to start doing that different. Too many pastors on the news, being arrested for stealing from the church budget. Too many pastors on TV being arrested for being caught with minors and teenagers and just disgusting nonsense like that. We got to get back to this ideology, we're not going to listen to you. You just need to go sit down in the corner and be quiet. That's the problem, is we are acting like Eliab when we should be acting like David. Right? That's what we get from this whole portion, right? Because Eliab didn't have faith, he had fear. And if we want in our own churches, but also in our own personal lives to succeed, we have to replace our fear with faith. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to have faith and give that faith to somebody. Say, hey man, God is going to give you this victory. But in verse 31, he says, when the words which were heard, which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. David said also to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight the Philistines. David says this to the king, to Saul. Saul already kind of knew David because David was his armor bearer. David was already working for Saul kind of as one of the young men who brought his armor to battle for him. And as he got ready for battle, David was one of the people who was in charge of taking care of the armor and putting it on him and so forth. So Saul kind of knew David. And David here telling King Saul, I'll go fight him. Everybody else afraid of this guy? I'll go fight him. I don't know what the big deal is. Saul says to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. Could you imagine King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table gather together and they're trying to figure out who wants to go, and everybody's like, I'm not going to fight him, you fight him. I'm not going to fight him, you fight him. And Arthur's like, well, somebody's got to fight him. And they're like, well, Arthur, why don't you fight him? He's like, I'm not going to fight him, you fight him. And then finally, like Sir Lancelot's like armor bearer, like his squire that like polishes his armor, is like, I'll go fight him. Nobody else has got to fight him. I'll fight him. I'm not afraid to fight him. They would all be like, you can't fight him. You will die. That's what Saul is saying to David here. Thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock, and I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered him out of his mouth. When he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. And now he's saying it to Saul, because nobody else cared. Now he's got an audience with the king. This is the king. This is a man David really looked up to. This was David's hero. This was sort of his mentor. This is the man he looked up to like his whole life up to this point. And so he says this to Saul, just knowing that Saul is going to learn to be motivated by this just the way that David was. And it doesn't really work the way he thinks it should. But David continues on and talking about these things. But the thing I want to show you is that Saul said to David, "Go and the Lord be with thee," at the end of verse 37. And in verse 38, Saul armed David with his armor. He put a helmet of brass on his head and armed him with a coat of mail. David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. So in other words, what happened was this armor that David had been taking care of for so long, Saul, thinking that this was going to be a truly generous moment, offers it to David. And he goes to put the helmet on, and it falls down and kind of covers up his eyes, and he puts the chainmail on, and it like drags the ground. He goes to tie the sword to his waist, and it starts, sticking into the ground. He goes to like lean backwards, and it stabs into the ground. It's dragging a line in the sand. And David says, "I can't take these." Right? This is a battle I'm fighting. And this is what he says. He says, "I can't," he doesn't say this, but this is the spirit of the thing, is David basically telling Saul, "I can't fight my battles your way. I have to fight my battles my way." So what does he put? He took his staff in his hand. He takes 5 smooth stones out of a brook and puts them in his bag. His sling was in his hand, and he draws near to the Philistine in his shepherd's clothing. Because he's not a soldier. That's not who he is. Who is David? He's a shepherd. So he's going to fight this battle as a shepherd because that's who he is. Listen, folks, no matter how far from home you get, no matter how much you climb that ladder, and no matter how prestigious you become, never forget who you are, right? That person that God made you, that you are because he made you that way. That so many times people are going to tell you, well, you need this and you need that, and you got to do this and you got to do that. I can't tell you how many stupid mistakes that I screwed myself up on so many times. I messed myself up on so many times as a young man. I wish I could go back and tell myself, hey, don't take that advice that they gave you. It's bad advice. Because I didn't know any better. Older men in the church, I thought I could trust them, and it wound up being bad advice for me. You've got to fight your battles your way. You and the Lord, and that's all you need. You don't need all these other people buzzing in your ear. You and the Lord. Let the Holy Spirit whisper to you, and then you go as he directs you. That's all you need. Learn to drown out the noise and just hear the Holy Spirit of God. Learn to hear from God and drown the rest of it out. Because you don't need all that noise. And notice, they think he's going to his death, by the way. They think he's going to die. He comes to the Philistine. The Philistine says to him, "Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves?" In other words, sticks. He sees the shepherd's staff. He sees the slingshot. He sees these basically children's toys and weapons of laymen, people who aren't born and bred warriors and soldiers like he was. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give thy flesh to the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field," thinking he's going to scare this normal kid off the battlefield. "You get out of here, or I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to take your body, and I'm going to make it food for the animals. You get out of here." David said to the Philistine, "Thou comest to me with a sword, with a spear, with a shield. That's fine. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied." You're going to see what I can do with a shepherd's staff, buddy. "This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand. I will smite thee. I will take thine head from thee. I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day to the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." Pretty good speech. "All this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." That is faith right there, folks. That's how it works. You go believing it. Sometimes we go and we say it, but in our hearts we're not so sure. It doesn't matter what we say, guys. It matters what we believe. If you really, truly believe, God's going to give you that victory. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, I did believe. I truly believed. I went out there and I said it. And and I did everything I was supposed to do, and it still didn't work out for me. And I hate that that happens, and sometimes God's plan for us is different than our own plan. But I can also tell you that a lot of times we can say we believe, but in our hearts, the Lord knows better. We've got to really, truly believe it. David really and truly believed it. It came to pass when the Philistine arose, he came to Drew and I to meet David, and this Philistine, Goliath, thought this is going to be over in no time. I'm going to kill this kid before he knows what even happened to him. That David hasted, ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. David did not run away. He ran toward the giant. Folks, when learning to fight your giants, it's not just about learning to wear the right armor. It's not just about having courage. You've got to learn to stand firm. When you know you're standing on solid ground, it doesn't matter if you've got a whole army, 20, 30, 40 people standing against you, telling you that you're wrong, that they're mad at you, that they can't believe you'd do that they can't believe that you would go and all these things. If you know you're right, you stand against the giants in the armies. They say, I'm right, and that gets God on my side, and if you don't like it, then you are in for a rough surprise, buddy. When learning to fight giants, you have got to learn to stand firm. Giants try to intimidate. They try to make you afraid. They try to make you scared. Romans 8:31 says, if God be for us, who can stand against us? The giant attacks. We know how this works out. Verse 49, David put in his hand in his bag, took thence a stone, slang it, smote the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. Charging toward David, he threw that slingshot. God gave that slingshotted rock a little extra heat, a little extra pepper on there, and it hit that forehead with the helmet covering it so hard it sunk the metal into his forehead, the rock into his forehead, pierced his head like a gun, and he fell. As he's running, fell down dead. David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him, but there was no sword in David's hand. He won this battle. Nobody thought he was going to win this. Everybody thought David, poor little David, is marching to his death. Eliab watching his little brother marching to what he thought was his death. And nobody thought for a second what was going to happen is what happened, because nobody understood what was happening. This wasn't just a battle of David versus Goliath. This was a battle of God against evil. This was a battle against of faith versus doubt. And Saul wasn't prepared for that battle, and Israel wasn't prepared for that battle, but there was this little ruddy kid named David who knew exactly what to do when it's faith versus doubt. When learning to fight giants, we have got to have faith. Folks, you want to start winning some of these spiritual battles? That's what it takes. It takes some faith. I want to thank you guys so much for joining me on this Bible study. We'll be back on Sunday morning for our next Sunday school, and I'm looking forward to it, and we'll see you guys then. So until then,